2025 from the representative of Poland and Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of General Assembly, requesting the resumption of the 11th emergency special session. I intend to conduct the proceedings of this meeting in accordance with the rule of procedure of the Assembly and the past practices on its emergency special sessions. In accordance with Rule 63 of the Rules of Procedure of the Assembly, the President and Vice President of the 79th session shall serve in the same capacity at the resumed 11th emergency special session. May I take it that is the wish of the Assembly to decide that the Credentials Committee of the 79th session should serve for the resumed 11th emergency special session. It is so decided. In keeping with established practice, I should now like to invite the attention of the Assembly to document A/ES-11/116 concerning member states that are in arrears in the payment of their financial contribution to the United Nations within the terms of Article 19 of the Charter. In addition, I would like to inform members that since the issuance of document A/ES-11/116, Cabo Verde and Grenada have made payments necessary to reduce their arrears below the amount specified in Article 19 of the Charter. This information will be reflected in document A/ES-11/116/Addendum 1 to be issued. May I take it that the Assembly duly takes note of the information contained in these documents? It is so decided. In this connection, may I further take it that it is the wish of the Assembly to follow the provision of Resolution 79/3 of 9 October 2024, by which São Tomé and Príncipe is permitted to vote in the Assembly until the end of its 79th session, and to also allow these member states to vote at the resumed 11th emergency special session? It is so decided. The Assembly will now resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. In this connection, the Assembly has before it two draft resolutions contained in documents A/ES-11/L:10 and L:11, and draft amendments to draft resolution A/ES-11/L:11 contained in documents A/ES-11/L:12, L:13, L:14, and L:15. Excellencies, colleagues, today marks a grim milestone. 3 years have now passed since the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, an act of aggression that has led to untold bloodshed and destruction. And yet, the tragedy continues. According to the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, civilian casualty rose by 30% last year compared to the year before. More life shattered, more futures lost. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine remains dire. The 2025 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan, launched last month, estimates that 12.7 million people, roughly 36% of the country's population, will require assistance this year. We cannot afford another year of this unjust war. The General Assembly has been clear and unwavering. It has adopted 6 resolutions demanding the immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine territory, and to an end to attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. These resolutions have consistently reaffirmed the need for a peaceful solution, one rooted in the Charter of the United Nations, in the principles of sovereign equality and territorial integrity. At a time when the United Nations is under intense scrutiny, and when the Security Council is deadlocked on matters of key importance for our collective security, the General Assembly has demonstrated its ability and its responsibility to act. Colleagues, Russian aggression against Ukraine is a grave violation of the United Nations Charter. As the 80th anniversary of the signing of the Charter approaches, we must reaffirm that lasting and meaningful peace will never be achieved through force. It will come through silencing the guns, turning to dialogue and diplomacy, and upholding the principles enshrined in the Charter. We must be prepared to promote inclusive dialogue and actively work towards a just and sustainable peace, one firmly anchored in international law, General Assembly resolutions, and above all, the will and the rights of Ukrainian and its people. This Assembly must stand firm in its resolve to find a way forward towards peace. Let's prove through actions and not words that a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace is within our reach. Thank you. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Mariana Betsa, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, to introduce draft resolution A/ES-11/L-10.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, Your Excellencies, this is a moment of truth, a historic moment not only for Ukraine, a historic moment not only for Europe, a historic moment for the entire democratic world. And the way we answer to the Russian aggression today, the way we answer to Russian atrocities and crimes, the way we answer to the aggression as a tool of statecraft will define not only the future of Ukraine, will define not only the future of Europe, it will define our common future, the future of the entire democratic world and the future of the UN. Are we ready to abide by the UN Charter? Are we ready to protect sovereignty and territorial integrity of states? Are we ready to abide by the principle of inviolability of borders? and non-use of force. Mr. President, today marks 3 years from the full-scale invasion by the Russian Federation. 3 years of Ukraine's resistance, 3 years of Ukraine's preservation, 3 years of Ukraine's fight and heroism. But let me recall that the war started 11 years ago in 2014. 11 years ago, Ukraine faced one of the most dramatic and challenging periods in its modern history. While resisting the attempt to impose dictatorship, Ukrainians demonstrated dignity and defended their choice for the democratic future in the family of European countries. While the sovereign choice of Ukrainians posed no real threat to Russia, the Kremlin perceived it as a threat to the imperial and non-colonial ambitions. In Kremlin's world, Ukraine was relegated to the role of a Russian satellite within its sphere of influence. For Russia, a military solution to this imagined threat was always an option. Disinformation, economic warfare, subversive activities, all of these laid the groundwork for the subsequent Russian aggression against Ukraine. And immediately after the victory of the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, Russia started its occupation of Autonomous Republic of Crimea and some parts of Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Weak international response to Russia's attacks on Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk back then led to a full-scale military invasion of my country from the north, east, and south 3 years ago. Russia has plunged the entire world into yet another war, a war totally unprovoked, unjustified, and unlawful, driven solely by morbid geopolitical delusions of the past, and yet the bloodiest war in Europe after the Second World War. And all of us became the targets. Ukraine and Ukrainians, because Russia denies our every right to exist. The world has become a target because Russian missiles do not only strike Ukraine, they also shatter the global security architecture, which 3 years into this invasion remains riddled with gaping holes, much like the country's countless residential buildings destroyed across Ukraine. The United Nations is under attack because Russia attacked every foundation of the UN Charter, blatantly violated the UN Charter and the core principles enshrined in it. Russia wants to replace the world based on international law to the world based on the rule of force. And finally, Russia attacked humanity. Humanity itself is under attack. An unsurprising reality, given that Russia has made medieval cruelty a hallmark of its military strategy against a peaceful neighbor and blackmails everyone with its nuclear weapons. Excellencies, Russia believed Ukraine would surrender. Russia believed Kyiv would fall in 3 days. Russia believed our government would flee. However, Russia miscalculated gravely. 11 years, Ukraine stands firmly and resists. The myth of Russia's military invincibility has been shattered. What was once seen as an unstoppable force has been met with resilience, courage, and determination, reinforced by the unwavering support of the free world. Your solidarity has demonstrated that unity and principles of the UN Charter are stronger than aggression and lawlessness. I want to reiterate our profound gratitude to over 140 member states that have stood with us, including those who have supported relevant resolutions in this hall, to those who provided military aid to Ukraine, to those who provided humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, to those who received our temporarily displaced persons, to those who help and continue to help bring our deported children back home, our prisoners of war bring home, and our illegally detained civilians to bring them home. To those who have contributed to the implementation of our Grain from Ukraine initiative, a practical effort to mitigate global food security threats stemming from this war. This war has never been about Ukraine only. It is about a fundamental right of any nation to exist to choose its own path and to live free from aggression. If aggression is justified and a victim is blamed for its resilience and will to survive, then no country is safe. Today, Ukraine fights not only for its own independence, but for a world of nations that are not divided into predators and prey, where no zones of conflict, of influence, and gray zones exist. We're fighting for a world which cannot be divided by any another Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. We stand up for the world where the future of a nation cannot be determined by another Yalta conference. Mr. President, 3 years of Russia's full-scale invasion against Ukraine have made it clear that we are dealing with a protracted, high-intensity war with extreme levels of casualties and spillover effect, rippled across different areas and continents. Let me stress once again that the UN were formed after the Second World War to prevent future wars and maintain international peace and security. Against the backdrop of ongoing and upcoming peace efforts, the General Assembly should take a pivotal role in determining the basis for the just and lasting peace in Ukraine and in Europe, as well as its standing for sovereignty of all states. A clear message that the vision of comprehensive, just and lasting peace, consistent with the UN Charter that we endorsed in this hall 2 years ago, remains valid and must be implemented without delay already this year. However, reducing the Assembly's position to merely stating that this desire is not enough. We need to reconfirm that the aggression should be condemned and discredited, not rewarded. Our position must include substantive elements and ensure that any future peace initiatives aligns with the principles of the UN Charter. This is the rationale behind the draft resolution that I have the honor to introduce today on behalf of the broad group of co-sponsors. My delegation moves that, after hearing the introduction of all the L documents, the Assembly immediately proceed to the consideration of our draft resolution A/ES11/L10 on the understanding that the debate would resume immediately after action on the draft resolution, and that the 11th emergency session would be only temporarily adjourned after the conclusion of the debate. We need clear guidance, not just silence, weapons, temporality, not just ceasefire, but to achieve a solution which is just, comprehensive, and sustainable. A solution that guarantees that there will be no repetition of what happened 3 years ago on February 24th, 2022, neither in Ukraine nor elsewhere. For us, for Ukraine, the path is clear. The only way, as our President Volodymyr Zelensky has stated, to ensure comprehensive, just and lasting peace is to reaffirm our commitment to the UN Charter and to agree that the principles enshrined in it, the principle of sovereignty and the principle of territorial integrity of states within its international recognized borders, must serve as the foundation. By adopting the draft, the General Assembly will also address the global impact of war and outline the areas where this impact has been particularly detrimental and where the engagement of all responsible nations would be crucial. In particular, there are global food security, energy security, the global economy, nuclear security and safety, and the environment, justice and accountability. As we mark 3 years of this devastating Russia's full invasion against Ukraine, we call on all nations to stand firm and to take the side of the Charter, the side of the humanity, and the side of just and lasting peace. Peace through strength, as the aggressor would never stop while seeing weakness. Excellencies, Ukraine's commitment to the UN Charter's principle traces back to the first day of our organization. Now it may seem to be symbolic that it was a representative of Ukraine who chaired 80 years ago the committee responsible for drafting the preamble, purposes, and principles of the future charter at the UN Conference on International Organization in San Francisco in 1945. Unfortunately, we haven't yet reached the point where principles enshrined in the UN Charter are respected by all member states. And the Article 51 of the Charter is just a matter of history. Definitely not, as my country has been compelled to exercise its inherent right to self-defense under the above-mentioned Article 51 following unprovoked, mean, brutal, genocidal war. While persisting in defending our country until the threat is over, we strive for peace. Peace that will give the world another chance to live according to the rules. When all nations, regardless of the size of geography, will equally enjoy their sovereign rights, rather than depend upon the mercy of more powerful. This is the spirit that should guide us during the vote on the draft resolution, advancing a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. I am confirmed that it will be a vote for peace, for the UN Charter, and for each member state. I urge you to vote in favor of Ukraine's draft resolution. Thank you so much.
I thank the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States to introduce draft resolution A/ES-11/L.11.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues, today marks 3 years since the escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war. We have all been concerned about the suffering in Ukraine and the war's effects on the rest of the world. Since the start of the war 11 years ago, the United Nations has repeatedly condemned Russia's blatant violations of the UN Charter. Multiple resolutions of the General Assembly have demanded that Russia withdraw its forces from Ukraine. Those resolutions have failed to stop the war. It has now dragged on for far too long and at far too terrible a cost to the people in Ukraine, in Russia, and beyond. Generations of Ukrainians and Russians have died unnecessarily as the war has brought the world closer to a nuclear confrontation. The longer it continues, the greater the suffering for both nations. This war must end now. It is time for member states to return to the purposes and principles of the Charter, mainly to maintain international peace and security, including through the peaceful settlement of disputes. Mr. President, as we gather today on this 3rd anniversary, what we need is a resolution marking the commitment from all UN member states to bring a durable end to the war. The draft resolution submitted by the United States makes this very point. Our draft implores a swift end to the conflict and further urges a lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia. This is what is needed now, and we urge all member states, including Ukraine and Russia, to join us in this effort. A simple, historic statement from the General Assembly that looks forward, not backwards. A resolution focused on one simple idea: ending the war. A path to peace is possible. Mr. President, that is why the United States opposed putting forward another resolution, and that is why we cannot support Ukraine's resolution, and we urge its withdrawal in favor of a strong statement committing us to end the war and work towards a lasting peace. The United States also requests the General Assembly take action on the United States' proposed resolution immediately following consideration of the Ukraine drafted resolution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation to introduce draft amendment A/ES-11/L-12.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
уважаемые коллеги,
distinguished colleagues,
сегодня мы с
today
вами являемся
we
свидетелями
are
исторических событий,
witnessing historic events.
выпадающих на долю далеко не каждого
Not
поколения.
every generation gets
На
a chance
наших
to see them.
глазах
In front of
оформляется
our eyes,
многополярный
the
мир,
multipolar
который должен
world
был
is
появиться еще
taking its
30 лет назад,
outlines. The
по
world that
завершении
should have
Холодной войны,
come into being 30
подведший
years ago at the
черту
end of the
под
Cold War,
идеологическим противостоянием
which
между СССР
put
и
a
Западом.
line under the
Тогда
ideological
мир
confrontation
был
between
полон
the
надежд на лучшее будущее,
Soviet Union and the West.
взаимовыгодное
At the
сотрудничество
time, the
ключевых
world
игроков
was
в
full
интересах
of
всего
hope for a better
человечества,
future,
прекращение
hope
войн
for
и формирование новой
cooperation
неделимой
between
системы
key
безопасности,
actors for the interests
где
of the
бывшие
whole
противники
mankind,
стали бы
ending of world
соратниками
and
и вместе
creating a
решали
new
бы
indivisible
международные
system of
проблемы.
security where former
К
foes would become
сожалению,
allies
тогда
and
эта
we work
логика
on
не
international
смогла
problems together.
восторжествовать, и
Unfortunately,
идеология
at the time,
сотрудничества
that
была
logic did not
постепенно
come to the
заменена
fore,
на
and the
философию
ideology of
игры с нулевой
cooperation was
суммой.
gradually replaced by the
Это был не
philosophy
наш
of the
выбор, и
zero-sum
мы
game.
много раз
This was not our
предупреждали о
choice,
тех
and
опасностях,
we have
которые
warned many a
несет за собой
time
подобная
about
логика.
the dangers this kind
В
of
итоге
logic
мир в
contains
конечном
within
счете
itself. As a
оказался
result,
на грани Третьей
the
мировой войны
world ended
из-за
up on the brink of a
реализуемого
third world
западными
war
странами своих
because of
геополитических интересов
what the
на
Western
наших
countries
границах
are
антироссийского проекта
doing,
Украины.
namely the anti-Russian project
Его
called
ключевым
Ukraine,
этапом
which is
стал
taking place at
антиконституционный
our borders.
государственный
Its
переворот в
key
Киеве
milestone
в
was the
феврале 2014
anti-constitutional
года,
coup in Kiev
в
in February
результате которого к
2014,
власти с
as a
западной
result
помощью
of which,
пришло
with
крикливое
Western
меньшинство,
assistance, a loud minority
исповедующее
came to
идеалы
power. This
крайнего национализма и
minority
русофобии,
has the ideals of extreme
нетерпимое к иному
nationalism
мнению
and
и ко всему
Russophobia.
русскому,
It is intolerant to
канонической
a different
православной
opinion, to
вере,
everything Russian, to the
воспевающее
canonical
сотрудников
Orthodox faith.
гитлеровских палачей,
It
которые
glorifies
вместе
the
с ними
accomplices
убили в
of
годы Второй мировой войны
Hitler's
сотни тысяч
executioners who,
евреев,
during
цыган,
World War
поляков,
II,
русских и
killed hundreds
украинцев.
of thousands of Jews,
Этот
Roma,
режим развязал жестокую войну
Poles,
против своих
Russians, and
русскоязычных
Ukrainians. This
соотечественников на востоке
regime
страны,
launched a brutal war
пытаясь стереть
against the
их идентичность
Russian-speaking
и заменить ее
compatriots in
на
the eastern
идеалы
of the country,
махрового
trying to
украинского
eliminate their
национализма.
identity and replace them with the
Тем
ideals
самым
of an all-out
Украина
Ukrainian
сама
nationalism.
запустила часовой
This way,
механизм
Ukraine
саморазрушения
itself
от
launched the
ненависти,
mechanism of
нетерпимости и вражды.
self-destruction by hatred,
Его
intolerance.
могли остановить Минские соглашения, одобренные
This could have
Советом
stopped by the
Безопасности
Minsk
ООН ровно
agreements,
10
which were
лет назад.
endorsed by the Security
Но
Council
вместо их
10 years
выполнения
ago. Exactly,
киевский
but
режим
instead of implementing them, the
при
Kiev
покровительстве своих
regime,
западных спонсоров,
with
как мы все с
the
вами
patronage
сегодня уже
of the
знаем,
Western sponsors,
выбрал курс на их саботаж,
decided, as
параллельно
we all
активно
know today,
вооружаясь и
decided to
готовясь к войне с
undermine the
Россией.
agreements and at the same time
Этот
arming itself and
механизм
preparing for a
попытались
war
еще
with
раз
Russia.
остановить граждане
The
Украины,
citizens of
три
Ukraine
четверти которых в
tried
мае
to stop this
2019
mechanism
года
again
проголосовали
when
за нового
3/4
украинского
of them
президента
in May
Владимира
2019
Зеленского,
voted for the new Ukrainian
обещавшего
president, Vladimir
установить мир на
Zelensky,
востоке
who
страны,
promised peace
защищать
on the
русский
eastern part
язык
of the country,
и права
promised to protect the
русскоязычных
Russian
граждан,
language and the rights of the
прекратить
Russian-speaking
героизацию
citizens,
нацистских
promised to
приспешников
end the
и
glorification
восстановить
of
добрососедские
Nazi
отношения с
accomplices
Россией.
and to restore good neighborly relations
Однако,
with Russia.
став президентом,
Unfortunately,
он
when he became
вероломно вернул
president,
страну
he
на
treacherously
прежний
turned the
самоубийственный
country
и
back to
человеконенавистнический
its
курс.
earlier suicidal and
Все
inhumane
это время
course.
Россия
All
со
this
своей
time,
стороны
Russia,
проявляла
on its
терпение и
part,
выдержку,
showed
не поддаваясь на провокации
patience,
Киева и его
restraints,
западных
did not
спонсоров.
give in to the provocations from
При
Kiev
этом
and
мы
its
четко
Western
давали
sponsors.
понять, что
And
не бросим
we
русских
kept
людей,
stating very
не
clearly at the
позволим
same time that
издеваться
we
над
were
ними,
not going to
не
give up on the
дадим
Russian
насильственно
people. We will not
переформатировать
allow
их
them to
идентичность.
be persecuted or
Еще
to
одной
have their
красной линией
identity
для России
changed,
было
to be changed.
вступление Украины
There
в
was
НАТО,
another red line for us, and
создававшее
that
неприемлемые
was
военно-стратегические риски
Ukraine's
для нашей
membership
страны.
in NATO. That created
Мы
an
пытались
unacceptable
по-хорошему
military
договориться
strategic
как с
risks for
Киевом,
Russia.
так и с
And we're
Вашингтоном
trying
и
to
Брюсселем.
sort it out peacefully
Но
with
нас
Kiev
не
and
захотели
Washington and
слушать и
Brussels.
воспринимать
No one
всерьез.
listened to us, no one took us
И только
seriously.
лишь когда 3
And it
года
was
назад
only
стало
when 3 years
совершенно
ago
очевидно,
it became
что обе
absolutely clear that
упомянутые
both
красные
of
линии
the red
Украина вскоре перейдет,
lines were
мы были
going to
вынуждены
imminently
начать нашу
crossed by
специальную
Ukraine,
военную операцию,
we had to
четко
start
зафиксировав
the
ее цели.
special military
При этом
operation,
с
stating
самого
clearly
первого
what
дня
its
мы
goals
говорили о
were.
том, что
From
готовы
the very
добиться
first
реализации
day
целей
of the
СВО
operation at the same
мирным
time, we
путем
kept
и
talking
отдаем
that
им
we
это
stand
почтение.
ready to
Господин председатель,
arrive at the special
сегодня
military
киевский
operations
режим,
goals through
находясь на грани
peaceful means. And
сокрушительного военного
in fact, that would
поражения,
be our preference.
бессмысленно
Today,
бросает
the
умирать
Kiev regime
десятки
is
тысяч
on the
украинских
brink
мужчин и
of a
женщин,
crushing military defeat
подавляющее
and
большинство
continues
которых приходится мобилизовывать
sacrificing
насилием.
tens of thousands of
Для
Ukrainian
Зеленского и его
people and women.
узурпировавших власть
Most of them have to
и
be mobilized by force.
отказавшихся в мае
For
прошлого
Zelensky
года
and his
проводить
clique, who
выборы
usurped
в
power,
нарушение
who refused
Конституции
in
Украины,
May last year to conduct
неприемлемы
elections in
любые
violation of
разговоры о мире,
Ukraine's constitution.
кроме как
They
на основе
find it's
ультимативных
unacceptable to
и
have
ничем
any
не подкрепленных на
talk
поле боя
about
положений так
peace
называемой формулы
unless they're
Зеленского.
on the basis of the ultimatum
В своем
and
маниакальном
the provisions from
стремлении
the
нанести России
Zelensky formula,
стратегическое
which has
поражение
no bearing,
и
no
на
relation to
узкой
what's
линии
happening on the battlefield.
некоторыми
And
западными
their
спонсорами,
maniacal
прежде всего
thrust
Великобритании,
to
бывший
inflict
актер
a strategic defeat
отверг
on Russia
парафированный в
and
апреле
egged on by some
2022
Western
года
sponsors, the
Стамбульские
UK first and
договоренности,
foremost. This
а
former
также
actor
законодательно
rejected
запретил
the
себе
Istanbul
и своим
agreements in April
подчиненным любые
2022,
переговоры
which
с
had already
российскими
been
властями.
initiated, and also passed a law
За
banning
прошедшие 3
himself
года
and his
Украина
colleagues
получила
to have
западной
any
помощи на
negotiation
сотни
with Russian
миллиардов долларов.
authorities. Over the past 3
Страну
years,
рекой текли
Ukraine
западные вооружения
received
и
hundreds of
наемники.
billions of dollars
Ее
of
снабжали
support. The country
разведданными.
kept receiving weapons
Иными
and
словами,
mercenaries
Украина стала
and
чем-то вроде
intelligence
частной
data.
военной
In other words,
компании,
Ukraine became
воюющей
a
за
private
западные
military
геополитические
company of
интересы.
sorts,
А
fighting
конфликт стал
for Western
классической
geopolitical
прокси-войной
interests. And
России
the
со
conflict had
странами НАТО.
become a classic proxy
Несмотря на
war
это, украинская армия
by
понесла
Russia against the
катастрофические
countries
потери,
of NATO.
и капитуляция киевского режима стала
Despite
лишь
that, the
вопросом
Ukrainian
времени.
army
это мы
suffered
говорили
catastrophic
неоднократно,
losses,
в том
and the
числе с этой
capitulation
трибуны.
of the Kiev regime is a matter of time.
Стремясь любой
And we have
ценой
said this
втянуть
many
западные
times,
страны
including this
в прямую
hall,
конфронтацию
trying
с
to drag the
Россией,
Western
в
countries
августе
at any
прошлого
cost
года
in confrontation with Russia.
Зеленский
In
развязал
August of last year,
самоубийственную
Zelensky
агрессию против
started
мирного российского
a
региона, Курской
suicidal
области.
aggression
В
against the
результате,
peaceful
как мы
Russian
сегодня знаем
region in the
достоверно,
Kursk
и
Oblast.
свидетели
As a
очевидцы,
result,
и
as
от
we know
попавших в
today
плен
from
украинских
witnesses
солдат
and
были
Ukrainian
зверски убиты и
soldiers who
замучены
were
сотни мирных жителей.
captured,
Украинские
hundreds
захватчики
of
с
peaceful
ведомым
citizens
своего главаря
were killed and
занимались
tortured.
мародерством,
And the
насилием и
Ukrainian
грабежом.
occupiers were
Расчет
involved in
был на то,
looting,
что Россия
violence,
ответит на эту варварскую акцию
and pillaging.
настолько жестко, что
The
общественное
expectation
мнение
was
на
that
Западе
Russia
вновь
was going
станет
to react to
сопротивлением.
this equally brutally,
Как
and
когда-то
the
помогла
public
настроить
opinion
часть
will once
мирового
again take the side
сообщества
of
на
Kiev.
антироссийский лад топорная провокация в
This
Буче,
similarly to
объективное
what was being
расследование
done by the
обстоятельств
crude
которой
provocation
киевский режим
in
всячески тормозит.
Bucha, whose investigation, by
Курская
the way,
авантюра
is being
Зеленского, как известно, не
slow-walked by the
оправдалась.
Kiev regime. The
Более
Kursk
того, она
misadventure
лишь
of
ускорила
Zelensky,
крах
as you know, was
обороны на Восточном
futile
фронте,
and
где
only
Украине
accelerated the
катастрофически не
collapse on the
хватает
Eastern Front, where
сжигаемых
Ukraine
Курской области
is
резервов.
lacking resources. They
Сегодня
were being burned in
украинская
the
армия
Kursk Oblast.
контролирует уже немногим
Today, the
более
Ukrainian
трети
army
изначальной территории
controls little
и
more
несет
than one-third of the
ужасающие
original territory there and
Параллельно
is suffering
российские войска
horrifying
успешно
losses.
продвигаются в
In
Донбассе,
parallel to that, the
Запорожской, Херсонской
Russian
областях,
army is moving
вошедших
forward
в
in
состав
Donbass,
России по
Zaporozhskaya,
итогам
and
референдума
Khersonskaya Oblast,
осенью
the
2022
oblast
года.
which became part of
Каждый день
Russia
приносит
in
названия
the fall of
новых
2022 as a result of
освобожденных
a
пунктов.
referendum.
И, к
Every day we
сожалению,
learn new
новые страшные
names of
цифры
liberated
потерь
places and
украинской
unfortunately
армии,
new
а точнее
horrifying figures
пушечного
of
мяса,
Ukrainian
которое
army
превратил
losses
их
or rather
Зеленский.
cannon fodder which
Новые
Zelensky turned it
российские
into.
регионы из Украины
New
стремятся вернуться
regions
сотни
of
тысяч жителей,
Russia are seeing
развенчивая
hundreds of
утверждения
thousands of
украинской
people
пропаганды
arriving
о
from Ukraine,
ненависти
and this
жителей этой страны к
disproves the
России.
Ukrainian propaganda
Мы
statement
говорили
that
неоднократно,
people,
мы воюем не за территорию,
people hate the
мы
Russians.
воюем
When
за
we've
людей.
stated this clearly, we're not
Как
fighting for
мы все
territories, we're
знаем,
fighting for people.
безысходность положения
As
режима
we all
Зеленского за
know,
последние недели
the
стала очевидной
hopelessness of
для основного
Zelensky
спонсора
regime
киевской хунты
recently
Соединенных
have become
Штатов.
obvious also to the main sponsor
Пришедшие
of
к
the
власти
Kiev junta, the United States.
республиканская
The
администрация
Republican
во главе с президентом
administration,
Трампом
led by
наконец-то
President
узрела
Trump,
настоящее лицо
finally
просроченного
saw the
украинского президента.
real face of the
Осознала, что
expired
он
Ukrainian
абсолютно не
president and
заинтересован в
realized
мире в своей
that he
стране,
is not at
так
all
как всеми
interested in having
силами
peace in this
цепляется за
country
власть,
because he's
боится
clinging to
демократических
power
выборов,
with everything
на
that he
которых
has,
у него нет
is
шансов.
fearful of democratic
Больше его ничего не
elections where he has
И он
no
готов
chance
принести в жертву
of
собственной
winning.
власти
He's
хоть
not
все
interested in
население
anything
Украины и
else,
все
and
ее
he's ready to
природные богатства.
sacrifice the entire people of
Скрылись и
Ukraine and
продолжают
its natural
скрываться
resource in order to
крайне
hold on to his
нелицеприятные
power.
факты коррупции на Украине, которая
Information
расцвела
starting up
буйным
to the
цветом
before about the unfortunate
воровства
corruption
западной
in
помощи,
Ukraine, which has
перепродажи на
blossomed
черном
under
рынке
Zelensky.
поставляемого оружия на сотни миллиардов
stealing of Western
леденящих кровь
assistance
нарушений прав
and the
человека и
reselling
свободы слова,
on the
за
black
которые
market
украинцы с
of
горечью
weapons
прозвали
supplies
свою
of
страну
hundreds of billions of dollars
концлагерем
worth,
имени Зеленского.
and the blood-curdling instances
Число
of
тех,
human
кто
rights
хочет покинуть
violations,
Украину, спасаясь
for
от
which the
репрессий и
Ukrainians
от отправки
nicknamed their
на
country
фронт
the
на
Zelensky
верную
concentration
гибель,
camp.
превысило все
The number of
мыслимые
those who want to
масштабы.
leave the
Но
Ukraine
киевский
in
князек
order to
никого из страны не
avoid
выпускает.
prosecution and avoid going to the
Понятно,
front
что в этих условиях
is
засевшего в Киеве бывшего артиста
extraordinarily
комического
high,
жанра крайне
but the
беспокоит прямой разговор между Россией и
potentate
США
does
о
not
том,
allow
как
people from the
урегулировать
country.
украинский
It's clear
кризис
that under
и
these
устранить причины, которые
conditions where
привели
we
к его
have in Kiev a
возникновению,
former
что кардинальным
comedian
образом оздоровило бы
is very
международную
worried
обстановку.
by direct
Не
negotiations,
меньшую
direct
панику
talks between
ощущают
Russia
и
and
в
the
ряде
United States
европейских
about the
столиц,
means
где
of
все эти
settling
годы
the
не только
Ukrainian
помогали
crisis and
киевской клике и
removing
покрывали
the
ее преступления,
reasons which
но и
led to
взращивали
its
русофобию,
existence,
распространяли неправду и
which
измышления о целях и
would
задачах СВО,
drastically
и в
improve the
результате
international
надули такой
situation.
огромный пузырь
The
лжи,
European countries are
выбраться из
also
которого
worried
им
by
теперь
that.
очень
They've
непросто.
spent years
Они
helping
стараются
the Kiev
игнорировать
clique
тот
and
факт, что
covered
ветер
its
переменился и
crimes,
оформился четкий
and
запрос на
they
мир,
nurtured Russophobia.
единственным препятствием на пути которого является
They try to
киевский
ignore the
узурпатор
fact
и
that
его
the
европейские
wind has
подельники.
changed and there is a clear
Оставшись
demand
без
for
руля и
peace
ветрил,
now. And
эти
the
жалкие миротворцы,
impediment
хоть и
to
пребывают в
that is the Kiev
растерянности, но
usurper
продолжают
and its
менторски
accomplices.
поучать
They're
остальной мир,
not at the
как
rudder
надо жить
anymore,
по
but these
правилам
pathetic
прекрасного сада.
peacekeepers are at a
Уважаемые
loss.
коллеги,
But
вносимый сегодня
you
на голосование
continue to
Евросоюзом и
lecture
Украиной
the rest
проект
of the
имеет
world
к этому
about how we're
пузырю
supposed to
непосредственное отношение
live in this
и
beautiful
состряпан
garden.
именно
Colleagues,
этой группкой,
the draft
которая
by
постаралась,
EU and
несмотря на
Ukraine
реалии на
today
земле,
is directly
с одной
related to
стороны,
this bubble.
заложить в него ключевые элементы
It is slapped
так
together
называемой формулы
by this
Зеленского
grouping
и
which is trying to
обанкротившегося
ignore realities on the
Бюргенштокского
ground on the
процесса, а с
one hand
другой
and include
максимально
into the key
закамуфлировать,
elements from the Zelensky
придать ему
formula, the
округлую
failed
форму
Bürgenstock
так,
process,
чтобы в глаза
and on
бросалось
the other
как
hand
можно
trying
меньше
to
того,
cover it up at
что
the same time,
отталкивает
round it
сегодня
up
от
to
подобных
make
затей
sure
многие государства
that the
глобального юга.
countries of the
Им
global
сегодня
south do
важны
not
цифры,
see such
чтобы выдать их за
unpleasant
поддержку
undertakings.
киевского режима
They are
и
interested in
постараться
figures
протянуть
today
его агонию еще какое-то время.
to present them as support of the
Расплачиваться
Kiev
за
regime and
своими
prolong its
жизнями
agony
будут простые
for some
украинцы.
time. But it will be
Задумайтесь об этом.
the everyday
Нас
Ukrainians
многие
who will pay for
спрашивают,
this with their
как было бы
lives. Think about
правильнее
this.
и полезнее
Many of us have
проголосовать по
asked
двум
us
представленным
about
текстам,
what would be the right
украинскому,
way
европейскому и
to
американскому.
vote, choosing between the
Сегодня
two
перед
texts,
каждым, кто
the
будет нажимать в этом
Ukrainian
зале
text
на
and the
кнопку в момент
American
голосования
text. Well,
по
everyone
проекту
who's going to press
Евросоюза и
the
Украины стоит
button
выбор.
during the voting
Либо
process
подыграть
today
Зеленскому и
has
его
the
спонсорам,
chance. You either play
поддержав
along
их
with
оторванные
Zelensky
от
and his
реальности
sponsors
заклинания, либо сделать
and
четкий выбор в
support
пользу
their
практических и
incantations which are
реалистичных шагов,
divorced of
которые
realities,
способны
or
остановить
make
военные
a
действия
choice
на
in favor
Украине
of
в
practical,
самое
realistic
ближайшее
steps
время.
which can
Не дайте себя
stop
обмануть.
the hostilities in
Проголосуйте
Ukraine
против
in the
украинского
very near
проекта.
future.
Примите
Don't get
верное решение.
deceived and make the right
Второй
choice
проект
here.
резолюции
The
представили наши
second draft
американские коллеги.
resolution was submitted by our
Этот текст,
American colleagues,
безусловно,
and
шаг в
this
правильном
text
направлении.
is, of course, a
С тем,
step in the
чтобы
right
эта инициатива в полной
direction
мере соответствовала
to make sure
пониманию
that this
достигнутых
initiative
в ходе
is fully in line with the
российско-американских
understandings
контактов
arrived
на
at
высшем
during the
высоком
Russian
уровне.
and American
Мы
contacts
внесли
at
в
the
него
highest and
правку о
high levels.
необходимости
We introduced an
устранения
amendment
коренных
to
причин
that about the
украинского
need to
кризиса, о
eliminate
чем, кстати,
the root
неоднократно
causes of the
говорил
Ukrainian
президент Трамп,
crisis, and this, by
и
the
что
way, was
способствовало
mentioned by
его
President
устойчивому
Trump several
регулированию,
times.
как это
This
предлагает в
would
своем тексте
help
Соединенные Штаты.
with
Рассчитываем на
its lasting
поддержку
settlement,
всех
as is
здравомыслящих делегаций
proposed
в этом
by
зале.
the United States in their text. And we
Проголосуйте за нашу
expect,
поправку.
we
Что
trust
касается
that
представленных
hope
к
for the
этому
support of
документу
all
поправок со
sensible
стороны
delegations
некоторых
in
государств
this
Европейского
room.
Союза,
As
то они
regards
направлены на
the
откровенную
amendments from
подмену
some
сути
states of the
американского
European
текста.
Union
Их
amendments
принятие
to the
превратит
American
здравый
text, well, they
проект
clearly replace the
с
essence
разделяемым всем посылом
of that text.
в очередной антироссийский памфлет с
If they
ультиматумами
were
в духе
to pass,
Бюргенштокского
then we
процесса,
will have,
который
instead of
лишь
something that's
отдалит
full of
урегулирование
common sense, we will
конфликта
have
и ничем
an
не будет
ultimatum
отличаться от
in the spirit of the
предыдущих
Bürgenstock process, and
политизированных
it will
продуктов этой чрезвычайной спецсессии.
distance the
Мы
settlement of the
будем
conflict
голосовать против этих поправок
away from us, and will
европейских
be
украинцев
not
и
different
призываем
from
все
politicized
государства-члены
products
поступить аналогично.
during this
Благодарю
emergent
вас.
special sessions. We shall be voting against them and urge all member states to do the same.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France to introduce draft resolution A/ES-11/13 slash L period 13, comma, L period 14, and L period 15.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
j'ai l'honneur de présenter
I have the honor
au nom de la
of
France
presenting on
les
behalf of
23
France
États
and
membres
the
de l'Union européenne et
23
du Royaume-Uni
members of the
trois amendements
European Union and the
au
United
projet de
Kingdom,
résolution
3 amendments to draft resolution A/ES11/L11
déposés
submitted
par les
by the
États-Unis
United
d'Amérique
States of America,
que nos pays
which
ne
our
soutiendront
countries
pas
will
en
not
l'état.
be able to support in its
Ils
current
s'appuient sur
form.
des messages
The
simples
amendments are based on
qui
simple
reflètent la
messages
situation
which
réelle
reflect the
en
real
Ukraine,
situation in
celle d'une
Ukraine,
guerre
that of a
d'agression
war of
menée par
aggression
la Russie
led by
contre
Russia
son voisin.
against its neighbor.
Le premier amendement
The first
remplace les
amendment
mots
replaces the
conflit
words Russian
russo-ukrainien
Federation-Ukraine
par
conflict with
invasion à grande échelle de
full-scale
l'Ukraine
invasion
par la
of
Fédération de
Ukraine
Russie.
by the Russian Federation.
Le deuxième amendement
The second
réaffirme
amendment
notre
reaffirms
engagement
our commitment
pour la
to
souveraineté,
the sovereignty,
l'indépendance,
independence,
l'unité
unity,
et
and
l'intégrité
territorial
territoriale de
integrity of
l'Ukraine
Ukraine
dans ses frontières
within its internationally
internationalement
recognized
reconnues.
borders.
Le troisième
The
amendement
third amendment
appelle à une paix
calls
juste,
for a
durable
just,
et globale en
lasting and
Ukraine
comprehensive peace in
respecte
Ukraine,
la Charte
which
des Nations
respects the
Unies
United
et les
Nations Charter
principes de
and the
souveraineté
principles
et
of
d'intégrité
sovereignty and
territoriale.
territorial integrity.
Nous appelons
We
l'ensemble
call
des États
upon all
membres
member
à
states
voter
to vote
en
in
faveur
favor
de ces trois
of these
amendements
three amendments,
qui rappellent
which
qu'il
recall
y a dans ce
that
conflit
in this
un
conflict
État
there is an
agresseur
aggressor state
et un État
and
agressé
a state subject to
et
that
qui marque
aggression.
notre attachement à la paix, une paix
And
juste
this
et
marks
durable,
our
qui
attachment
doit
to
avoir pour
peace and a
fondement
just and lasting
la Charte des
peace,
Nations Unies
which must
et
take
le
as its
droit
basis the
international.
United Nations Charter and
Voter
international
en
law.
faveur de ces
Voting in
amendements,
favor of
c'est
these
voter
amendments
en
is a
faveur de
vote
la
for
Charte
the
des Nations
United
Unies
Nations
et ses
Charter
principes.
and its
C'est
principles.
voter
It is
en
a
faveur
vote
du droit
for
international.
international law.
Je vous remercie.
Thank
Monsieur
you,
le Président,
Mr. President.
je vais prononcer
I
une
would now
intervention à
like
titre
to make
national.
a statement in my
Nous
national
sommes réunis
capacity.
aujourd'hui,
We're meeting today,
3 ans jour
3
pour jour
years,
après le
day
début
for
de
day,
l'invasion à
after the
grande échelle
beginning
de
of the
l'Ukraine par la
large-scale
Russie,
invasion
pour
of
appeler à
Ukraine
une
by
paix
Russia to
globale,
call
juste et
for a
durable en
global,
Ukraine.
just and lasting peace
Il y
in
a 3 ans,
Ukraine.
la Russie
3
lançait
years
une
ago,
guerre d'agression
Russia launched
brutale et
a brutal
injustifiable
and unjustified
contre un
war
État
of aggression
souverain,
against a sovereign
l'Ukraine,
state,
qui
Ukraine,
ne la menaçait
which
en
was
rien
not threatening it
et
in
dont
any
elle occupait
way,
déjà illégalement
and
une
it
partie
already
du
was
territoire
illegally
depuis
occupying part of
2014.
its territory, and that
Ce
since
faisant,
2014.
la Russie a
In
violé
doing this, Russia
et continue de
violated
violer
and
de façon
continues to
flagrante la
flagrantly
Charte des Nations
violate the
Unies
United
et les
Nations Charter
principes de
and the
souveraineté
principles of
et
sovereignty
d'intégrité
and
territoriale que nous
territorial
avons tous
integrity
en
that we
partage.
all share.
La Russie inflige depuis 3
Russia,
ans
for 3 years
des
now, has been
souffrances insupportables
inflicting
aux
unbearable
populations
suffering
civiles
on the
ukrainiennes.
civilian population
Des
of
millions
Ukraine.
d'Ukrainiennes
Millions
et
of
d'Ukrainiens
Ukrainian
sont
men and
aujourd'hui
women
réfugiés
today
ou
are either
déplacés.
refugees or have been
La Russie
displaced.
bombarde de façon
Russia is
indiscriminée
bombing
les villes
indiscriminately
et les
towns
installations
and
énergétiques civiles de
civilian
l'Ukraine.
energy
Elle présente un
infrastructure
risque
in
pour la
Ukraine.
sûreté
This is a risk
et
for
la
the
sécurité
security
nucléaire.
and safety of
Elle aggrave
nuclear
la crise alimentaire dans le monde
establishments.
entier.
It is worsening the
Elle
food
bafoue le droit
crisis throughout the
international
world. It is
humanitaire.
flouting
Elle
international
se rend coupable
humanitarian
de
law.
crimes de guerre,
It
voire de
is
crimes contre
guilty of war
l'humanité.
crimes and even
Les
crimes
auteurs de
against
ces crimes
humanity. The
devront
authors of these
rendre des
crimes
comptes.
must be
La
held to
France
account.
poursuivra son
France will
soutien
pursue
aux
its
juridictions
support for
internationales et
international and
ukrainiennes,
Ukrainian
ainsi qu'à
jurisdictions,
l'ensemble des
as
mécanismes
well as for
d'enquête
all of the
visant
mechanisms
à
of
établir les
inquiry aimed at
responsabilités pour les
establishing
crimes
responsibility
commis
for
par la
the
Russie
crimes
en
committed by
Ukraine.
Russia in
Monsieur le
Ukraine.
Président,
Mr. President,
la Russie doit cesser
Russia
sa guerre
must
d'agression
cease its
en
war of aggression
Ukraine.
in
Dès le
Ukraine.
16 mars
Since the
2022,
16th of
la
March
Cour internationale de
2022, the
justice a
International Court of
demandé
Justice
à la
has
Russie
demanded that
de
Russia
suspendre
immediately
immédiatement
suspend
ses
its
opérations
military
militaires.
operations.
Depuis le 27
Since the
février
24th of
2022,
February
c'est la 8e
2022,
fois
this is
que
now the
cette
8th
Assemblée
time that this General
se
Assembly
réunit
is
pour
meeting
condamner
in order to
l'agression russe et
condemn the
appeler
Russian
au respect de
aggression and
l'intégrité
to
territoriale
call
de
for
l'Ukraine.
the respect for the
La France est
territorial
engagée
integrity
pour un
of
règlement
Ukraine.
du conflit.
France is committed
Nos
to a
plus hautes
resolution of the
autorités
conflict.
sont à
Our
l'œuvre.
authorities
Nous appelons
are
une
at the
paix
highest
globale,
levels and are
juste et
working on
durable,
this.
fondée
We
sur la
want a
Charte des
global
Nations
peace that
Unies
is just and
et le droit
lasting, based on the
international.
UN Charter and
Une paix
international
qui
law.
ne récompense
Peace
pas
which does not
l'agresseur, qui
recompense
ne bafoue
the
pas
aggressor,
les
which
droits
does
de
not
l'agressé.
tread underfoot the
Une
rights
paix
of
qui
the party
respecte la
under attack.
souveraineté,
Peace which respects
l'intégrité
the
territoriale
sovereignty,
et
territorial
l'indépendance de
integrity
l'Ukraine.
and independence of
Cette
Ukraine.
Assemblée, depuis 3
This
ans,
assembly for 3
avec ses
years now, with its
résolutions sur la
resolutions
situation
on
en
the
Ukraine,
situation in Ukraine,
a été
has
la
been the
boussole
moral
morale de cette
compass of this
organisation,
organization,
la garante
the
d'un ordre
guarantor of an
international
international
basé sur des règles règles
rules-based
de
order
l'égalité souveraine
based
des
on the
États.
sovereign equality between
Là où le Conseil de
states.
sécurité
Where
a
the
échoué,
Security Council has
l'Assemblée
failed,
générale a
the
dit
General
le
Assembly
droit.
has defended the
Aujourd'hui
law.
encore,
Today,
elle peut
once again,
contribuer à
it
la
can
paix
contribute
et
to
tracer
laying out
un chemin
peace,
vers une paix solide,
peace
juste
towards
et de long terme,
solid, just
en
and
accord
long-term
avec
peace
nos
in
règles
accordance
communes.
with our common
Dans cet
rules.
esprit,
It is in this spirit
chers et chers collègues,
colleagues,
apportons tous notre plein
that we
soutien
give
au
our
projet de
full support
résolution
to the
proposé au vote
draft
ce jour par l'Ukraine.
resolution tabled
Il est
today by
équilibré
Ukraine. It is
et
balanced and
consensuel.
it is
Il est
consensual.
l'aboutissement
It
d'un vrai
is the result of
processus
a
de négociation
genuine
inclusif
process of
et
negotiation that
transparent.
was inclusive and
Nous appelons tous
transparent.
les États
We call
membres à
upon
le
all member
soutenir.
states to support it.
Depuis le début de
Since
l'agression,
the beginning of the
l'Ukraine se
aggression,
défend
Ukraine has been defending
conformément
itself
à
in
l'article
accordance with Article
51 de la
51
Charte.
of the
Elle
Charter.
veut la paix.
It wants
Elle veut
peace.
que cesse
It wants this
l'agression.
aggression to
Elle veut
cease.
participer
It wants
à
to
tout effort
participate
de
in
règlement
any
du conflit.
efforts to resolve the
Elle a
conflict.
raison.
It is
Un
right.
règlement du conflit
A
qui serait
resolution to
décidé
the conflict
sans
that will be
l'Ukraine ni
decided
l'Europe
without
ne saurait
Ukraine and
être
without Europe
durable.
will not be a
Il
lasting peace.
consacrerait le primat de
It
la
would
force
establish the
sur le droit.
primacy of force over
En
over
légitimant
law
la
by
revendication de sphères
legitimizing the
d'influence
claim of
au
spheres of
mépris
influence
de la
in disregard for
de
the
l'égalité
sovereign
souveraine des
equality
États,
between
il
states.
préparerait
It would set the
les
stage
guerres
for
de
the
demain.
wars of tomorrow.
Le soutien de
The
l'Assemblée
support of the
générale à la
General Assembly
résolution
for the
ukrainienne
Ukrainian
ne serait pas
resolution
juste un autre vote. L'Assemblée
is not
générale
just
des
another
Nations
vote.
Unies
The United
doit
Nations
tenir
General
le
Assembly
cap,
must stay the
celui du
course,
droit,
that of
celui de la
law,
souveraineté des
that
États
of the sovereignty
et du
of
respect
states
de
and
leur
respect for their
intégrité
territorial
territoriale,
integrity,
celui de la
that of
responsabilité,
responsibility
celui
and
de la
that
justice.
of justice.
Je vous remercie.
I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France. The representative of Ukraine has moved that after hearing the introduction of all L documents, the Assembly immediately proceed to the consideration of the draft resolution A/ES-11/L.10. The representative of the United States has moved that draft resolution A/ES-11/L.11 be considered immediately after action on draft resolution A/ES-11/L.10. This is on the understanding that if the Assembly were to so decided, and if the Assembly were to subsequently adopt draft resolution